And starting in verse 9, we repeat truth about God. And if you notice all the way through this, 9, 10, 11, and 12, he keeps bringing up attributes of God and repeats them. And that's something, as David looked back over his life of loneliness and desperation and sorrow and fear, he saw one truth most clearly, that God was righteous. He says that right in these verses. Verse 9, I've proclaimed the good news of righteousness. Verse 10, I have not hidden your righteousness. And he says, God, you are righteous. And the key New Testament book on righteousness is Romans. And you know that has 66 times it mentions the word righteousness. And it says that God is righteous when He declares all in sin, and when He declares the way of salvation, and when He expects from us in sanctification what He wants, and then when He's sovereign and righteous in His bestowing of gifts. And those 4 sections are the whole book of Romans. And it's all about God, His righteousness. And David said, God, you're righteous. In my perilous years when I was a fugitive, I found refuge. You were righteous. In my prosperous years when I was victorious in every battle and sat on the throne, you were righteous. And God, you're righteous in the punitive years when I sinned and you had to chasten me with Bathsheba and that whole family debacle David goes through. And finally, God is righteous in His peaceful years when David had gathered his treasures and invested them all in the temple. Like David, we need to repeat truth about God. Satan is a liar. He wants us to believe a lie. He wants us to believe that God is withholding something we should really have, that God's timing is bad, that God's word can't be trusted, that we need to take matters in our own hands. And when we do that, just like when my car decides it's going to go on its own, it crashes. You know, when you don't put the brake on and let it, go down a hill or something. God says, I want you to trust and repeat that I'm righteous in all that I do. Now this morning, verse 13, what's so neat about this, and you're going to see we transition tonight into Psalm 70, because starting in verse 13 of Psalm 40, you find exactly the words of Psalm 70. Psalm 70 is the bottom end of Psalm 40 cut off and made into a separate psalm. And basically what we find in this section, starting in Psalm 40 and verse 13, is, like David, we need to rejoice in God even when we're in the pits. And this is what he says in verse 13. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let them be ashamed and brought to confusion. Verse 15, let them be confused or confounded. Verse 16, let all who seek you, here it is, rejoice and be glad in you. You see where David came? And like David, we need to come there too. We need to rejoice in the pits. I was gladdened by the woman that I read in the New York Times, nameless, faceless woman, but when everybody was rioting, about day 2 of this whole mess, she, it said, screamed and started screaming the 23rd Psalm that we did. And she said, the Lord is my... And all of a sudden the whole crowd, it said briefly, began to quote the 23rd Psalm with her. You know what's interesting? What she was trying to do is to get them to rejoice in the pit. That's what the Lord wants from us. David is such an example, and what he does here is he cries to God when his life was hollow. Life was so bad at this time that David says 4 times, make haste, come now, don't wait, hasten. And what he said is, God, I'm crying to you, and you can make me rejoice even when I'm in the pits. Now, that's a choice before us every day of our life. You and I are not in the South Gulf Coast area. We're up here. And when we compare what we struggle with what they're going through, we should be rebuked. And if anybody should be rejoicing, it should be us. And if you learn to rejoice now, then if we have a F5 tornado come through and wipe out our way of life, or if we have our own personal F5 disaster come through our own body or family or home or job or life or emotions, if we can rejoice now, if we can learn to rejoice evermore, in everything give thanks and pray without ceasing, then we will have the pathway out of the pit. no matter what pit we find ourselves in. You see, these things are true no matter what. Like David, repeat truth about God. That's the pathway out. Like David, rejoice in God even when we're in the pits. Like David, we need to learn to renew our submission to God and say, it's not my life, it's not my way, it's not my timing, it's not my plans and my goals. It's yours. When you walk out to your car after this service, what a picture of submission. It's still there. Unless, of course, someone stole it, but our deacons are patrolling with they are guarding you right now. But I'm talking about without thieves, your car will still be there. It'll just be waiting for you to tell it what to do. It's your bondservant. It wants to respond. You stick that key in and turn it, boom, it says yes. And you crank it a little bit, and you start turning it all directions, and it says, yes, I want to go that way. Yes, I want to go that way. It's a bondservant. And we need to renew our submission to God. You have no idea what God will do with your life if you let Him be the master, the driver, the owner, the director. And David said, I'm going to let you drive my life. I renew my submission, and I'm going to learn to rejoice. Verse 13, look back at it before we leave. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me from the pit. O Lord, make haste to help me. In verse 16, let all them who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. Let all such as love your salvation say continually, the Lord be magnified. Do you know how you know that you've met with the Lord in the pits? You don't get out of them as quick as you can. You look up and you say, help me right where I am right now to magnify you and to rejoice where you've put me. To magnify you where you've put me. I renew my submission to you.